we need to honor these ancient practices that understood how to work with the elements in ways that lasted for multiple generations, without the unintended consequences of our hubris of believing we have the answers, when we don't listen to nature and what she's telling us.
There are so many examples of the unintended consequences our hubris has brought in, and there are many on Hawaii.
Yes. Yeah.
With military intervention, ecosystem work. It's just, the list is long, and I won't belabor it here, but I often touch on this particular thing. It's like, without having the context of those generations as deep-seated, story-based knowledge that's passed down from one generation to the other, without having that, we make foolish mistakes constantly.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Welcome back to Care More, Be Better. I'm so glad that you're all here with me today. And to kick off today's show, I want to share a big update. As of today, our community has helped to plant more than 31,000 trees. This is through our partnership with forestplanet.org. Now, I had a goal of planting 20,000 trees this year, and obviously we've screamed right past that. So the new goal is perhaps to get as many as 40,000 planted, doubling our earlier efforts. Now, we're planting one tree for every new subscriber to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and on our newsletter at caremorebebetter.com. So thank you all for being a part of this growing movement. If you haven't yet subscribed, just go to those spots, give us a subscription, and we'll plant up to 4 trees on your behalf. Now, today's guest is someone whose work embodies everything regeneration in every sense of the word. Aubrey Morgan Yee is a cultural strategist and systems change facilitator with a PhD in alternative futures and Indigenous politics. She is the founder of Our Beloved Futures and Hokuao Farm and Temple in Hawaii. It's a sanctuary that's dedicated to rewilding land and reviving ancestral practices. Now, Aubrey serves as Steward of Living Systems at Project Biome alongside Dr. Zach Bush, where she leads cultural strategy with Culture Hack Labs. As someone who uses narrative to drive systems change, much as we do here, she also hosts a podcast. It's called Beloved Futures Podcast. There, she curates conversations on ecological futures and regenerative design. I'm so glad to have you here today, Aubrey. Welcome to the show.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. And that's really exciting about the trees. What an incredible achievement. That's awesome.
We could all serve to plant more trees, right?
Absolutely.
So,
right. Yeah.
Now, I know that you've described yourself as a mythopoetic futurist. I was hoping that as we get started, you could share what this means, what it means to you, and how myth and imagination inform your vision of the future. I just think this will give people a real nice taste of your perspective and where you come from.
Amazing. I love that question. I've come up with that term mythopoetic. It was as I struggled to think about what is it about the way I write and the way I think and what I'm bringing to this work, especially the work of the futures. And so mythopoetic, obviously blends the word myth and poetry. My style of actually being, writing, being, speaking, living is what I would call poetic. And I think what's baked into that is this understanding that life is beautiful, it's precious, there's a poetry to everything. When you're connected into earth and you're really paying attention to what's happening around us, there's so much poetic beauty that we're constantly immersed in if we just pay attention to it. So there's like a way in which living poetically invites us into something more beloved. And it's where I find my work being really resonant. And then this idea of myth, I think, is so crucial because as we start to unpack both systems, futures, anything where we're trying to understand, getting to the root, the word radical means to the root, getting to the root of some of these issues we're dealing with and some of the things that we're facing, we have to understand the very, very deeply held myths and metaphors that are holding those systems in place. And those are often unconscious. They're really deep. They're cultural. They're passed down through generations. They're reinforced in a variety of ways through systems and the ways that we live and are being together. And so when we get to the root of the myth and we really understand like, oh, that's that deep thing that was planted so long ago that is creating all these effects that we're seeing, then we can rewrite that myth and actually have a chance of building something brand new from the ground up. So instead of tinkering sort of, in the machine and being, okay, how do we make little changes here and there? I really think we're in this moment of getting down to the radical root of things, understanding where that mythical, metaphorical belief lives in us, in the systems, in the world, and then shifting that so that something new can be born from that new seed of the new myth. So that plays into, the writing that I do, the thinking that I'm holding, the spaces that I curate, and the invitation that I would like to invite anyone who's listening into that inquiry of what are the myths that are guiding your life and guiding the world around you.
Now, this also, to me, connects to ideas that we have talked about on this podcast before, like slow living and really leaning into your experience of the moment, to things like nature bathing and listening to what's inside, the inside truths that each of us bring, while also causing us to reflect on what we're all doing here, where we came from. What is that prehistory or earlier moment? What do we know to be true just about what it is to be living here? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a spiritual component to it for sure. Myths write the world that we live in. They create culture. They help us understand our place and our meaning. And I think, one of the sort of the troubles of modernity is we've lost a lot of our connection to myth. So our myths become almost stories of commodification or understanding the world through the lens of something like capitalism or colonialism or these other isms that are shaping the systems that we're in, because we don't have those deeply held cultural myths that are from something else that's more earth-based. Right. So if you think of something like in work, we've come up a bunch against the metaphor of time is money. Right. That's a myth, that time is money, but it's a deeply held myth or metaphor that underlies sort of this myth of progress, and this idea that our time should be something that is spent well is another, say metaphor we might use, like spend your time well, which is connected to that metaphor of commodification. So how have we become almost like spiritually bankrupt in the culture that we exist in, you and I, in this modern world that, asks us to make sure everything has a value that's financial? And what does it look like to find myths that are related to other kinds of resource, other kinds of connection, other kinds of ways of being together that don't necessarily rely upon commodification or financial exchange to feel like they're whole and available to us? So yeah, that's something I think about with your question there.
Yeah, I've listened to a few of your episodes now of your podcast. I listened to you talk deeply with Zach Bush, and also your most recent episode in which you talked a bit about mindset. I think it's a popular perspective to really champion this idea of an abundance mindset, but I personally am challenged to see how that can apply when we know we have limited systems, like limited resources, even financial resources. I wonder if you could comment on that as well, and perhaps provide what might be different about the perspective you bring.
Yeah, that's a great question. So abundance to me is, it's not tied to things like finances or material goods. It's actually an abundance that comes from the experience of the mundane being both mysterious and magical and mystical. So really tapping into the abundance that's available in something like a sunrise, or the abundance that's available in something like a piece of fruit. And that requires a different mindset, what we call like a shift within, of reconnecting back to earth-based wisdom and earth-based understandings of abundance. That is that idea of giving freely without thought of return. So it's less about a transactional exchange of I'll give you this so that I get that. It's more of an appreciation mindset. And maybe that's something that needs to be added to the lexicon. It's appreciative abundance. It's not so much about having, getting, owning, possessing. It's more about paying attention to what is actually around us that's available in the present moment, that we can feel abundance with, right? So, and that can be a relationship in our life that brings us joy. That can be, a smile at a stranger walking down the street. There's like an abundance that is outside of the capture of capitalism and capitalist modes of being. That is the true abundance that I'm thinking about when I speak those words. That isn't something that can then be commodified, traded, exchanged, and become transactional in that way, because it evades that sort of capture. Because I agree, we are in a and part of why we're seeing, the devastation we're seeing is because the the scarcity mindset that comes from a desire to possess tells us that we have to hoard, we have to get ours, we have to make sure we've got enough because there isn't enough for everyone.
Right?
We can't share. There isn't, I mean, there's some, I'll get the statistic wrong, but it's basically like we have enough clothing on planet Earth to clothe everybody like 6 times over. It's not being shared around in the right ways. And we're ending up with piles of clothing discarded in the Atacama Desert in Chile, right? That's burning in the middle of the night. Like these absurd things are happening because people are hoarding, and the hoarding is perpetuated by a desire for more, which comes from a need to have more material good. So I guess the abundance mentality I'm speaking to is tied to a couple of shifts. And one is shifting away from materialism and more to animism, which is re-engaging with the world as an animate set of forces. So there's less about like dead objects that we take, use, extract, and discard, and more about living beings that we're in relationship with. And then also moving from separation to interbeing. So that, even underscores that idea that we're not separate beings, that there actually like is a relational field that we're part of, relationality, but over rationality. A lot of these kind of things, they're all interwoven with a new way of understanding ourselves as human beings that I believe invites us into a much more joyful experience of life, where you actually don't feel the need to hoard and the need to have so much material good. You can share with your neighbor. You can offer resources when you have them. You can see people as whole human beings, not as transactional objects with which to get what you need from. There's just a big shift in that I think we need to lean into in this time.
Well, it's the end of September, so I already feel like Christmas is upon us.
Oh my God, totally.
It's just thinking about materialism. This is something I come to every year, right? I have young boys. Of course, they want the latest, greatest, most amazing toy. We've leaned into used a lot, right? And I even interviewed Stephanie Safarian, who wrote Sustainable Minimalists and who has a podcast of the same name, to talk about the simplicity of coming from a different world when you're doing something like gift giving. And she focuses on just 5 gifts. And if I could remember them correctly, it was something like an experience, a read, so something to read, something to experience, and there were a couple of others, but really limited to only 5 gifts per individual in the family. And, something to wear, something along these lines, but really just simple and no plastics. Nothing in the plastic realm can enter her home. And that dramatically limits the sort of waste that a single household will produce. Now, we're in a constant battle of what toys to get rid of when we have the new season coming, because I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, right? And this is life. But I also really resonate with this fact for me that I grew up as a poor kid. And when you grow up as a poor kid, you tend to want to hold on to things because there's this fear that if you get rid of it, you might not be able to get it again, right? Even though I don't have those same financial constraints today. So this is where my desire to be a minimalist and also somebody who lives sustainably often come into conflict. And why I think so many people find this abundance mindset to be confusing, right? So I'm so glad that you've shared this perspective today. And I wanted to share a thought I was having as you first got started talking about mythopoetic, being a mythopoetic futurist. I decided to buy a read for each of my kids. And so I got this DK book set specifically on early life, prehistoric life, from dinosaurs to 1,000 years ago, for my younger child who has expressed a lot of interest in learning about the origins of man and what came before and why does this species no longer exist, but we're here, and what happened before I was alive. And what was that like? He's asking me all of these really deep, thoughtful questions as a 7, almost 8-year-old. And then my 10-year-old, who's really starting to ask questions about God, I got him a book on myths around the world, well, a set of books, right? So it's, one book dives into Norse mythology, another into Greco-Roman beliefs, and so that we can speak about all these different perspectives of what God is and how he might interpret that. Because I feel like whatever you believe God to be, it's a highly personal experience.
Totally.
And I personally don't believe in God with a capital G sitting on a cloud that's male somewhere up there, right? To me, it's more like within and around. And if I was to describe God simply, I would say God is life. anything living is a representation of God, and it's mythical and mystical and difficult to understand, and sometimes wildly simple and other times wildly complex. So as I started in my academic world, I studied archaeology, I studied prehistory. I wanted to also know the answers to the questions that my son asks me, about origin of life, where we come from, why, what is the reason, why did that species die out and this other one exist? How much Neanderthal DNA is really in all of us? And is it simply the Ramapithecus or another species that shared that DNA and it shows up and we don't really know because it's so complicated. Like DNA is so complicated. So I want for people to look at life and to look at this experience and this world of abundance with curiosity. I feel like if we all approach it with curiosity, then we're going to grow more. And to me, that's what this life experience is all about.
So beautiful. Rumi said, sell certainty and buy bewilderment. And I love that because I hear in what you're sharing is like this beautiful inquiry that your children are sitting in, different inquiries for each of them based on where they're at and their passions. And we've come to a point where we feel like we have to get the answer. And when you realize there actually isn't an answer, there are a variety of thoughts and potential answers and ideas and hypotheses. And if you can just get excited about the questions and the inquiry and what that does to a relationship, right? So if you look at your experience of the gift, how beautiful that you've now opened up a portal for connection with your kids. I mean, chicken skin, just thinking about this, where, you could have given them an object and they go off and they play by themselves and they don't talk to you about it. Maybe they report back how it was, but you've now created a portal of inquiry together that's going to build your relationship and deepen your relationship. Like that's a gift. That's a true gift. That's not just a thing that's been exchanged that, is transactional and allows them to then go off and be more in their aloneness. You're actually creating pathways for engagement. So what a beautiful way to think about a gift. And then to invite them into this idea of inquiry is never ending, right? So it's going to change as you move throughout your life. It's going to change as the world changes around you. It's going to change as new information comes in, and getting excited about that never ending inquiry that doesn't have to have a definitive answer. Some things have definitive answers. What am I going to eat for lunch? Like, how much gas is in my car? Like there's some definite facts we have out there, right? But these bigger questions, we don't have to know the answer. It's an ongoing inquiry that deepens our connection to ourself and our soul, deepens our connections to others. And if we can approach others with the curiosity of wanting to know how their inquiries are shaped and what they're thinking about around these topics without the need to control their opinion as well, as long as people are in a space of not harming and, shared general set of values and ethics, we can go into these really big, beautiful inquiries together. And that's the kind of culture I'd like to see us building, where we're critically thinking, we're allowing questions to rise, we're not having to come up with an answer, we're simmering in the inquiry together. I mean, what a beautiful way to build spaces for conversation within families, between families, with neighbors. I'd love to see more of that in my world.
Now, I want to ask you about Hokuao Farm and Temple. I understand that it's both a sanctuary and it's a site for rewilding. Tell me about what inspired you to create the space and what daily stewardship might look like there.
Thank you for that question. You did a great job pronouncing it. The Hawaiian names can be Hokuao. I was like, yes, you did it.
People should do every letter in Hawaiian, every letter.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a beautiful language. And what it means is it's Venus when she becomes the morning star. It's the Hawaiian name for Venus when she becomes the morning star, which is also the farmer's star. And the name dropped into my consciousness in a meditation one day. So it was a gift from the universe of like, this is what it wants to be called. And it's a smaller farm. Hawaii land is very expensive. We're going through a really interesting, Hawaii land base has been a very interesting story way back when, from the Ahupua'a system, when the Hawaiians were, pre-contact, living quite sustainably in this very beautiful watershed management system that had a lot to do with trading and sort of, people having different parts of responsibility. Like there was one person who grew all the bananas and traded with the person who grew all the fish. And it worked really, really well for a long time. And then the idea of private property came in, and there was sort of a big shift to that way of being because of, contact and what happened with colonialism. And then that shifted into plantation agriculture, which was basically big swaths of land being taken up by large corporations like Dole and all the ones that we know of that just planted monocrop and used lots of over time pesticides, and all of that created plantation economies, brought in lots of indentured servitude to work the plantations, that sort of classic story that then shifted to a very easy template for Monsanto to come into the islands and to bring all the chemical ag that was really horrific for a while. And then we worked very hard to get that out of the islands. So they've left, unfortunately, just to go to other lands, which is a whole nother conversation we could have with that horrific story of agriculture. But so now we've got all these large swaths of land that are being divided back up again, purchased up by developers from the sale of, say, Dole or Monsanto, these other corporations that have left, and then being broken up into smaller bits, which is in itself problematic if we don't keep up with policy and other ways of thinking about land. So I'm actually working with some dear friends who do a lot of policy work around agriculture, and rethinking how do we change some of these laws around ag where, young farmers can't live on ag land potentially, or have worker housing, just some stuff that's outdated because it's based on the plantation economies and the ways of doing monocrop ag. So we've got this really unique opportunity with these small parcels to bring in a different kind of agriculture that I think is more permaculture based, some tropic farming, some of the leading edge, more earth-based technologies that work well on smaller pieces of land. So part of the vision was to think about what it would look like to take one of these smaller pieces of land and what can one do with that kind of size of agriculture, because you don't have the same scale you've got with monocrop. And we've got systems set up for monocrop. So what supports are needed to wrap around that kind of agriculture? So if we've got a whole patchwork of these kinds of things, and particularly on the North Shore of Oahu where I live, that's what's happening, is this patchwork of all these little farms. And I'm seeing this really incredible resurgence of young people who really want to farm. There was a trend in Hawaii, still exists. Unfortunately, part of the problem is the policies have been created to combat the gentleman's estate. So people would buy up a 2 or 5 acre parcel, say they were going to farm, throw a couple of papaya trees around, and then say they were farmers, but basically build a beautiful house and have a really inexpensive gentleman's estate. So we're trying to fight against that trend, but move to something else and see, that these young farmers who don't actually have a lot of money, but can afford to buy a small ag plot, are willing to live in a container home or some other sort of alternative form of housing to really farm the land using permaculture principles. How do we support that movement? So the vision for the land that we purchased is around that, and thinking about how do we support, some of that organizing, some of that learning, some of the people that are doing those practices. We're not quite there yet, but we're, focused on that as the vision, and also bringing in other activists and people working in these spaces from around the world to bring their wisdom to this place and share information. So the temple kind of arose out of that impulse, was what does it look like to both heal ourselves spiritually, heal the aina, the land that we're on, and then heal culture and society around these things related to food, land use, community building. So as an alternative space to gather and do some of the work, but blending the spiritual and the physical, right? So I think permaculture is a very spiritual practice. It's engaging with earth wisdom. It's deepening into the understanding of how nature works. So one of the first things we did was build a food forest windbreak along one of the fence lines that's, very kind of syntropic farming, permaculture based, with all food crops and, native plants and that sort of thing. Another one along the riverside that we have. So everything we've done in terms of planting has all been according to a master permaculture plan. We're working with an amazing permaculturist named Drew Wilkinson, who's got Growing Together is the name of his organization, and other farmers that work with him that have come to help us steward it. But just trying to do everything from those principles. And then we have teaching kids. So is one of the other things we hold really close, because my kids have been homeschooled. So we have a homeschool group of kids that comes once a week, and they get to do qigong, so kind of like movement and deepening into spiritual practice in kid version. They do a little bit of ukulele, so arts and culture, and then they learn something from the farm. So they'll go with our farmer Keegan, and they'll go into the veggie field, and maybe they plant one day, maybe they harvest one day. They're making food with the food that's on the farm. So trying to get into the kids' minds too, and just seeing them get their hands dirty and into the earth. So it's a variety of things. And we're in like a constant inquiry with the land. Like, what does she want to hold? What is she asking for? And what's possible with a smaller farm like ours to be, not just a space of growing food, but also a leader in thinking about how we live with land and think about our food and build community from a different perspective and paradigm.
Hawaii is, of course, in the tropics, and many things grow really well there. However, I think most of us understand, if we visited Hawaii, that yes, there are papaya farms, and you've got banana, and then sugar cane, some coffee on particular islands, right? But When you visit one of these smaller household farms, you tend to see that it's more of an agroforestry approach and working with the land and a lot of what's naturally there. You might see ginger here and a papaya plant over there, and then you have perhaps a taro stepped garden. They're usually on some sort of a tiered space. If you have a hillside, that works really well, right? Because it helps them to like naturally drain. And I just wonder if you could paint the picture for our audience about like how many different things you're able to grow on one of these small farms on one of the smaller islands. Oahu is rather small.
Yeah, absolutely. And very populated too. So that's part of the challenge.
No, we're not talking Waikiki here though.
Absolutely. No, yeah, exactly. It's a different part of the island. So yeah, we've got an orchard. We're really blessed with the land that we are stewarding that already had some mature trees. So a lot of citrus. The area we're in is a little bit drier. So citrus grows better than it does in some other parts of the island that are wet. The islands are all sort of similar in that the west and north end of the island tends to be more dry. The east, the most wet, and then the south, somewhere kind of in between. So we're kind of on the north, almost to the west. And so it's a bit drier in general. So citrus grows really well, lemon, lime, pomelo, all of those kinds of fruits. We've got an orchard of that. We've got avocado. We've got cacao. We've got jackfruit. We've got chico, which is a lesser known fruit. We've got soursop. We just planted some longan, which is a relative of lychee, seeing how that one's going to do. We planted some pomegranate. We've got bananas, obviously papayas. Those sort of grow really easily and well all over the place. We've got a bunch of herbs. So all the different, basil, rosemary, thyme, motherwort, some like healing herbs, that sort of thing. Then we've got a veggie field that we rotate. And so we're learning what grows well. In some parts of the season, we've got beans and snap peas and carrots and beets and all of that. And other parts of the season, we've got more like cucumbers and tomatoes. We're applying for a grant right now to do like a hot house for the cucumbers and tomatoes and that sort of thing. We've got a bunch of ulu, which is breadfruit. It's a really great food that grows here in Hawaii, and that it makes beautiful things like ulu hummus and mashed ulu, and you can do frozen ulu and smoothies and things like that. There's mango. What else do we have? Lots of stuff. So we have some sugar apple, which is sort of a rarer fruit, but yeah, lots of different things.
So this is the sort of thing that helps a small crop farmer be able to be profitable because you have such a variety. You're not just focused on one thing. If you were focused on one thing with only a couple of acres to farm,
it doesn't work.
Yield would never be enough, right?
Yeah. And it's value-added products is what we're learning too. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening here in the islands around helping small farmers come up with value-added products. So something like an ulu hummus, where you're not just selling the ulu, you're taking the ulu, you're processing it, making a hummus and selling that, that product. Or jackfruit hummus is another one that's really good. Or, our neighbors next door are doing smoothie packs because they've got a ton of mango trees. They just planted a bunch of papaya. So what are those ways to move into some value-added products? But I think distribution is a huge challenge for this new way of farming. We have an amazing organization here in Hawaii called FarmLink that I think is such a beautiful model that it sources from all across the island. So it's all locally grown. And it's everything from actual produce to value-added products to meats, eggs, dairy, but it has to be local. And then it's like an online marketplace. So you can go online, place your order. It's not a CSA box. You pick what you want. It goes into a basket, gets delivered to your house. If you buy over a certain amount, it's free delivery. So it's a game changer. The hard part is they're struggling to make it. So to me, one of the questions is like, why aren't we subsidizing that kind of work versus the other ag subsidies that are going to more of the monocrop method, right? In this great transition, we need to be shifting those priorities and those policies. But that's something that's a bigger conversation that I'm sure you're engaged in a lot as well. So,
especially since it takes so much insofar as resources to import foods.
Yes.
I mean, one of the things I do not do when I go to Hawaii is buy blackberries and raspberries from Watsonville, near where I live.
Totally.
It doesn't make any sense.
Totally.
There's so much beautiful fruit on Hawaii. Why don't I eat the fruit that comes from here?
Yes.
It's special in a way.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the things that we forget when we start to homogenize our lifestyles. Here in the States, on the mainland, when you go from one town to the next and they start to look really similar, like they've got the same shops, same stores, same network, same type of distribution. And I do see it's more challenging for some of the local farms to get their foods into the right hands. Now, there are some similar efforts that are in part, I think, championed by some of the local larger farms, but that integrate the ability to buy essentially like you're buying from a CSA, but more as you need it. And you just get a reminder, hey, we're about to ship out something. You can customize, do whatever you need, and also browse the finished goods like the hummus you might mention of those local producers as well, so that you are able to eat more from within a 100-mile area, which is really what is largely recommended. If you want to live a more sustainable life, you can make those choices 3 times a day or however many times you snack. I mean, you can get to a point where you're getting most of your nutrition from within that 50 or 100-mile radius. And here in California, that's a lot easier to do than it is on Hawaii. And grains in particular are a challenge, right? I don't know that any grains are really grown on Hawaii.
One of the interesting innovations is the canoe plant products that I've seen. My dear friend Bryn Foster is a company that works with like some of the canoe plants, which are the plants that came over with the original Hawaiians on their canoes when they voyaged their way here. So there's some of the really hardy plants that were able to make the seagoing voyage that they knew they needed to survive, that allowed them to, establish themselves in this place and survive here. And those are amazing plants like ulu and kalo and some of these, sort of core cultural plants. And they're making flowers out of that. So you can use, and it's great for people who are gluten-free, says it's not wheat, so it's another option. And those things are becoming more readily available. But I loved what you're saying about, not buying blueberries in Hawaii, right? I think we made this mistake for a long time of thinking progress and success meant we had everything available to us. And actually, no, progress and success is the ability to be creative with the constraints that you're given in the situation you're in, because that's when you really come alive with your creativity and your resourcefulness and your resilience. And so if we start to see that constraint not as an imposed sort of like a punishment, it's like, no, this is a creative constraint that allows us to think differently in a new place, that engages us with that place, that has us thinking about different foods to eat. It's good for our body because we're bringing in different kinds of foods into our body. It's healthier food because it's grown more close to where we're at. So it travels less, has more nutritional content, all these things. There's a lot of positive, feedback loops engaged in that simple choice that don't have to feel oppressive, that actually can feel like an invitation. So I think it's shifting that mindset again from feeling like I can't do this thing to what can I do? What becomes possible when I lean into that constraint? Right? And see that as a celebration, and rather than something that we have to feel I'm giving something up. I'm actually gaining something through that process.
And then the financial resources stay in the community and nurture the community as opposed to some multinational carrier or shipper.
Exactly. It
makes more sense to me because it's like benefiting the people. Totally. And if we make changes to work in this way, then a farmer can earn more than 8 cents on a dollar and not have to rely so much on subsidies in order to grow a specific crop. I really just think it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I'd really love to, at this point, shift our conversation to talking about cultural and Indigenous futures. Mm-hmm. How has your background, specifically in Indigenous politics, shaped the way that you approach systems change?
Gosh, so many ways, and such a great question. It was a real journey of unlearning, undoing, and self-reflection for me to end up in the Indigenous politics department at the University of Hawaii. I grew up here in Hawaii as a white settler colonist. My parents came in their 20s. My dad was in the military, sort of a typical story of one of the ways that settler colonists arrive here. And I knew very little about the Hawaiian story, and the true story of Hawaii and all of that until I got to college, because it was intentionally left out of most curriculums. So we had like one Hawaiian class in 8th grade, for a little bit. And we learned some words and some history, but very kind of glossed over, which is, indicative of a settler colonial culture. And so when I ended up in this political science department with a lot of really radical Indigenous politics thinkers and political theorists, it was like, oh, that's what's been going on here? I had no idea. So it was a deep internal reckoning of my role as someone that, was part of this history. And so I went through a very kind of deep, undoing and a self-forgiveness of like, okay, my shame and blame doesn't serve anyone. How do I become a positive ally? And seeing the real richness of Hawaiian culture and the Indigenous peoples here and the amazing story of their resistance. The Queen, placed in house arrest in 1893, would not sign the treaties that she was being ostensibly forced to sign by the American businessmen who put her there, sugar farmers and people that were starting the plantations. She just said, no, I'm not going to sign these papers. And so we're literally an occupied territory of the United States. She never abdicated the monarchy. And most people don't know that, outside of Hawaii. It's becoming more known. When I learned these kinds of facts, it was like, wow, there's this whole history here that I'm unconsciously participating in as a settler colonist. And yet this is the only place I know of as home. And so what does it mean to be really attached emotionally, spiritually, connected to a place and still feel that and not feel like I have to sever that, but also know that it's my responsibility to be in service to the Indigenous peoples who've been harmed, and how might my life become a prayer with that at its center. And so that feels really like it drives a lot of my work. And so it just became a real discovery process for me of learning from these incredible Indigenous scholars who were, doing everything from like, what does epistemology from a Hawaiian perspective look like? What does research from a Hawaiian perspective look like? What sort of questions are we asking? How are we showing up in space? What are we doing? What's the quest for sovereignty look like? How do we have those conversations? And so it's become like a core piece of, I feel like, why my soul incarnated in this place, is to be able to understand the complexities of those histories and to sit with that paradox and move forward anyway, and to understand that my leadership is actually to be from behind in many ways, and to lift up the leadership of the Indigenous peoples of this place and support in different ways, from the side, from behind, whatever that looks like, from my positionality as someone who has different kinds of access to power and privilege just by nature of being a white woman in this place who went to an elite private school with all the power players, right? So yeah, there's like so much there, but it's become something that really defines how I think about my work and my role and my purpose, I'm constantly in inquiry around.
We'll talk about chicken skin. I had chills for much of that answer. I often think about the need to really engage in place-based learning about where you are, where you're from, what it was like before settlers arrived, what changed because of that, and then how you fit in the overall. I have had this thought for the last long while that I think one of the reasons so many people push back against this idea of really support for and acknowledgement of what we've taken from Indigenous peoples is this lack of connection to Earth, or this feeling of, well, then I grew up here, like you grew up on Hawaii, right? You were born there. It's not like you had a choice of where you were born. That's where you were raised. That's where you feel most at home. You're connected to the land too, right? And then you tell white people who feel like they're underprivileged, that don't have necessarily the financial resources of some others, and they say, well, I didn't get all these privileges you're talking about, and what you're saying that my home and my connection to this land that my family has been on for generations isn't worth anything. And so there's this defensiveness that kind of erupts, and instead of acknowledging and empathizing and understanding that we took without permission, that these are unceded lands, that it's as if someone came into your family's farm and just took it all from you. So, why can we not have the ability to look in the mirror and acknowledge that truth, and then look to the people that deservedly were on that land and nurturing it and stewarding it for generations, and the loss that they've experienced, the grief that they have to confront on a daily basis? I mean, if we don't reflect on that, if we don't focus a little bit on that place-based learning and acknowledge what's true, then we are stuck in a situation where we won't learn, we won't grow, we won't build solutions. We will just build what we call a better mousetrap to rape in a different way. I mean,
totally. We'll build walls. We'll build divides. We'll build, more war.
And become less connected.
Yeah.
And less connected.
Yeah.
So it's such a big challenge. I was thinking, I've been to Hawaii a lot. I love the islands. I feel very at home there.
Yeah.
And I've always felt like whenever I land somewhere tropical, like this is where my body wants to be.
Yeah.
So, I've confronted the Howley go home attitude quite a bit, as I am somebody who wants to adventure into the backwoods too, and go on the hiking trails and and sometimes in unwelcome parts of the island, like where they're basically just like, you are an outsider. This is ours. Stay out, you know?
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. It's not personal. You don't have to take it personally. It's trauma, and that's understandable trauma.
Now, the Robinson family was responsible for a lot of the sugar farming on the islands for a long time, but they ceded back Ni'iau to the native peoples. I don't know how many people really know about that story.
Yeah.
And they still do operate a small sugar plantation, I believe, because I still have found like Robinson family raw sugar on the island. Could you talk about that a bit and how, or any knowledge that you might have?
Well, I have some friends that are descendants of the Robinson family. Yes, and they're really amazing, good people, you know, and some sit in this inquiry really deeply, and others are less maybe aware of some of these issues. And I think that's true of a lot of the original missionary families. It's like any sort of, you know, wealth, multi-generational wealth that we're looking at in our country, which was founded on slavery and genocide itself, right? So there's I think a lot of people in the younger generations that are in a deep inquiry of what is mine to do now, you know, that these histories exist and that this harm has been done. What do reparations look like? And what you were speaking to around, you know, how do we shift this mindset of feeling afraid that something's going to be taken from me too? It's like there's a third way. Like, could we imagine a future in which we all get to participate together, but maybe some things have to be given up, and that's okay. You know, there has to be some compromise, and there has to be a repair. Like my friend said the other day, he calls it Maoli minded. You know, Maoli, Kanaka Maoli being the original Hawaiians. Like, you can be Hawaiian without being Hawaiian. It doesn't have to be blood quantum. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of being. And what you shared about sort of the earth-based piece, I think that's a core of it. And when we can look at how incredibly beautiful all of these indigenous cultures, you go backward, were earth-based. They were connected to earth. I think that's such a key pillar of what's happening right now, is finding our connection back to earth. We've been severed through, you know, technologies of colonialism and capitalism. Many of us in white bodies who are, you know, sort of scattered around the world and have lost our connection to ancestry and genealogy, we've been severed from that connection to earth. So doing some work around what does it look like to reconnect? And that can happen in so many different ways, as you know, everything from putting your hands in the dirt to, you know, different practices and ceremonies to buying your kids a book and having a conversation about things. Like, what does it look like to reconnect to that? But yeah, I think there's a beautiful moment right now on earth where there's a lot of people that are starting to feel these things in their bones, feel them in their gut, feel them in their heart, and are willing to have the hard conversations around what it looks like to repair. And not from a place of like swing the pendulum back and then somebody else gets harmed, but something else that allows us to move forward in a different way. And I do think that Earth is at the center of that she's inviting us into that conversation, and that when we reconnect with her, there is a pathway that we can find that doesn't have to be either or, black or white, us or them, in or out. You know, that's something else.
Well, I think we get on the journey through storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Like helping people understand that these cultures had the technologies that we didn't perfect.
Amazing technologies. Yeah.
So, I mean, I was thinking when you first started this conversation, you spoke about kind of the localized fish farms that were being run by Hawaiians. I don't know that you used the specific word farms, but essentially the Native Hawaiian peoples had fish farming dialed.
Yeah,
like
100%.
They know how to manage estuary development and create little pools that supports the wildlife that's connected to the ocean. Yep. They never had to use pesticides or antibiotics. They didn't work outside of the confines of nature. They worked with it. They worked with how the natural systems work, and they were able to feed their populations for generations without any issue.
Yeah.
Now, we farm in a much different way. And, you know, I have a whole podcast episode dedicated to this when I connected with Simon Setra, who's the author of The New Fish, which is a really critical look at fish farming off the coast of Norway, and specifically salmon. I encourage people to look at that. It's ugly.
Yeah.
And essentially lifts the skirt on all of the challenges that we face from how we have procured that specific food. It's an extension in a way of the earlier work of Paul Greenberg when he wrote For Fish. Like we chose, his underlying premise is that we chose the wrong 4 species of fish to rely on in farming. and that we needed to work in more of a way, the way the Hawaiians have worked with their local ecosystems, and or work with fish that grow easily in ponds as opposed to things that need large, vast open water to grow it. So I think these are stories that we need to understand and connect to. And if we can also rely more deeply on the experience, understanding, and knowledge of these eco-based experiences with Indigenous people leading as champions, then we can understand better how to thrive in concert with nature as opposed to try to create some computer-based solution.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I mean, there's like the traditional ecological knowledge and what we're now calling, I call Indigenous knowledge sciences. And it's this paradigm shift. And that was a lot of what also came for me out of the Indigenous politics department, because I looked at sort of science and the desire to govern nature from a very Western kind of technocratic paradigm versus how Indigenous peoples think about the human-nature relationship. And we discount these very deep understandings of place. You know, people who for generations may have stewarded one fish pond or one area and have deep knowledge of that place and how it works and the way the nature is there somehow get discarded by the scientist who comes in for a 6-month stint and does some like data-based research and collecting information. And that's somehow more relevant or more respected. And that just, we have to flip that whole paradigm, because the people that understand the place, they've got the generational knowledge that we need in a time like now, where we can actually see like what happens in this place over time. How do we empower those people to be really honored and respected in the work that they're doing, rather than, you know, this other way of thinking about science and thinking about land management and all of that. And that relates to, you know, your story about the fish. I was recently at, there's a limu harvest area on the southeast coast in Waimanalo on Oahu, and they're doing traditional limu practices, and they'll have like a work day. And I went with my daughter for this beautiful cohort on climate change and peace that she was part of. I was 12 at the time. And after we worked with the limu, we went next door, like just down the beach a little ways, where there's a fish pond that they have been restoring and cultivating and sort of protecting and working with. It's been there for about 800 to 1,000 years is the guesstimation. And it's a series of rocks all piled around this area of beach against the sand. And there were people there working on it, and they were teaching the girls about what they're doing. You know, one of the things they said was that every rock that they find has been on this beach since that time, since 800 to 1,000 years ago. They never alter the rocks. Each rock is seen as an ancestor, because what he explained was, you know, when you die, you go into the earth, you become magma, you come back out as rock. So you are literally an ancestor. This rock is an ancestor. So we don't change its shape. We don't change its form. We look at what it wants to teach us and who it wants to be next to. And then you build the rock according to that information that you're receiving from the rocks themselves, also with the understanding of the tides. And then the way that the rocks are stacked, there's enough movement of water between them to create flow, so that even when there's a big storm, the whole wall doesn't fall apart. And then literally right behind this fish pond rock wall was a man-made cement beach erosion wall. And it was butted up against the estate where the Obamas are building their house. And there was Secret Service standing out front of this wall as these Hawaiians are maintaining the rock wall. And I was just looking at the incredible informational irony of that moment, of the fact that here is this man-made, you know, straight brick wall that we know from science this creates erosion. And then you've got this 800 to 1,000-year-old rock wall that Hawaiians have been stewarding that actually allows the beach to breathe. And one of the guys said, you know, when they were first building the rock wall in the Obama's house, some of the Secret Service came up to them and said, hey, you know, you guys you're not going to be able to keep doing this work here because of security issues. And they said, try to make us move. They're like, we've been doing this for 800 to 1,000 years. If you want to put your house somewhere else, you can. And it was just like, yeah, that's where we're at. You know, like we need to honor these ancient practices that understood how to work with the elements in ways that lasted for multiple generations, you know, without the unintended consequences of our hubris of believing we have the answers, you know, when we don't listen to nature and what she's telling us.
There are so many examples of the unintended consequences our hubris has brought in, and there are many on Hawaii.
Yes. Yeah.
With military intervention, ecosystem work. It's just, the list is long, and I won't belabor it here, but I often touch on this particular thing. It's like without having the context of those generations as deep-seated, story-based knowledge that's passed down from one generation to the other. Without having that, we make foolish mistakes.
Yes.
Constantly.
Yeah.
At any rate, I wanted to get into talking about ecological futures as it relates to Project Biome. I did get the chance to listen to your interview with Dr. Zach Bush, who started Project Biome. What excites you most about the work that you're doing in living systems there?
Lots of different things. So Project Biome came out of as Zach's vision of, the microbiome in the gut, which he worked with for years, and then understanding that the soil of our planet is sort of another microbiome of a planetary biome. And so what is, Project Biome being, how do we think about the earth as one biome that's in concert working together, and the health of that is something that we prioritize. So we started the work in South Africa. That was sort of the place that became relevant in terms of where we wanted to do these first interventions. But everything we're designing is with the eye toward living systems, and thinking, the way I say it to the team might seem like an interesting analogy, but I'm like, how do we think like a virus, right? So how do we think about whatever we're creating here in South Africa, having like enough sort of DNA or structure that it can move rapidly and spread, but not have the hubris to think it knows the answer in the next place, to then embed in that place and to pick up the information from that place and those peoples to then mutate and become what it needs to be there. That's sort of the general strategy, I think, of the work that we're doing. Is we talk about it as connected tissue work, mycelial work. Fascia is the other metaphor we use a lot. So the fascia in the body being the organ that is very little known actually in modern culture, that it moves everything around and it's really important, but it doesn't get front stage a lot. But how do we become that? So that interstitial tissue that's moving information, allowing flows to happen. So we're doing different things. Like one of the call I just got off before this one was a group we're working on around funding and rethinking philanthropy. So bringing in funders to understand like how might money move differently on Earth right now to get to the peoples and places that are deep in community on the ground doing the work without the mediary in the middle, so that you're not losing funds along the way. You're not creating these really oppressive power structures of like reporting and all this oppressive stuff that these small community groups have to shoulder when they're just trying to get, literally meager funds in the face of the amount of money and wealth that's circulating on the planet. So we're starting a cohort to kind of question some of those power dynamics, to really dive deep into the inquiry of what it looks like to rethink philanthropy in a way that's supportive to the regeneration movement on Earth. Thinking that we don't know how long money is going to even be useful if our financial systems start to break down. How do we get that while it's still useful and can still build things and empower communities and get them set up for whatever's coming next? Let's get the flow going. So that's one of the prototypes that we're playing with. Another one's called the Bioregional Accelerator, which is, bioregionalism has become another buzzword. It's, again, somewhat problematic maybe in certain ways, but I see how it worked here in Hawaii, and I think it does have a lot of resonance right now in the field. But working with some of the community projects that we've been supporting in a particular area of South Africa called Mpumalanga, which is near Kruger National Park. And so there's about 12 organizations that'll be in the accelerator. And we're, again, creating the question of what does it look like to build the interstitial tissue for a nascent network of folks who are working in place, each holding a different piece of the systems puzzle, don't really have line of sight on each other or relationality. How do we support that relationship building, their understanding of each other's work, so they can do something more and amplify each other's capacity? And weaving into that a youth fellowship, so youth leadership, finding leaders, youth leaders in the area who are under-resourced. South Africa has like 63% unemployment of youth right now. So a huge need for leadership that's different, that thinks about things from a more kind of creative, entrepreneurial lens, or, ability to self-start. So empowering some youth with some leadership capacities, critical thinking capacities, and letting them lead in that network that we're building, and bringing in also elder wisdom. So having a few Indigenous elders from that region to inform some of the work that's happening in the organizations, and bring, again, that Indigenous knowledge to sciences and traditional ecological knowledge into the accelerators. That's another experiment that we're trying as a prototype to see how might this work. Working with World Wildlife Fund with some funding they provided for something called the Heal the Planet Initiative, which is another great group that's doing really incredible regeneration work. Yes, it's things like that where we're trying to rethink, how have these systems that ostensibly may have worked for some time, even, things like conservation in South Africa is problematic. Fencing off places like Kruger National Park, where you displaced a million some people and then put them into townships. So we're questioning a lot of those narratives and trying to design other ways to bring people together and break down some of that way of working. So that's in that place. And, all of these things are big dreams, right? So we have to do one step at a time. And the hope is that could become a prototype or a map to other places to do something similar.
Yeah, you have me thinking about so many different things as you explain this approach to kind of this cellular or viral transition of how you approach one area, get things working there, and then take what you can apply elsewhere and put it into effect. There's a Stanford B Lab researcher and professor who's looking at taking elements of design thinking into things like the climate advocacy or climate activist space, so that you can have different cells essentially working towards the same ends, but with perhaps different stakeholders and people that are running it. So it's not going to be exactly the same from one spot to another, which I think respects the fact that there is also cultural differences.
Totally.
And, the needs of the area may be different. So how do you amplify your work, if not through being massively adaptable?
Yeah,
I think that acknowledgement is critical.
Yeah.
I want to do a time check because I realize we're at 1:30. We're at an hour, but I have 2 more questions I'd like to ask before the close.
Absolutely.
At this stage, I wanted to talk about your personal journey and your vision so that perhaps we can leave people with an idea or tools that they can take with them into their own exploration. What inner practices or rituals help sustain you in this work of imagination and restoration? And in part, I want to bring this up because sometimes we can approach this work and start to feel defeated. There's just bad news after bad news if you're looking at the environmental science of the world sometimes, warming oceans, increasing storms, and lack of funding, just being 3 things.
Totally.
Base, right?
Yeah.
So often you can feel a little bit at a loss. So I guess I'd just really like to understand what tools or what inner practices or rituals bring you through these challenges to stay imaginative in your focus on restoration and regeneration.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd say out the gates is get used to feeling overwhelmed, because it's kind of where we're at. And so when we stop thinking, okay, this is going to change, or somehow it's going to get better, it's not so much that things are going to, I'm trying to say this in a way that's hopeful, because it is hopeful. But the reality is we're in a time of uncertainty. We're in a time of volatility. We're in a time of systems breakdown. And so we have to get really comfortable with that and not have it throw us off center. So that said, sort of knowing that this is where we're at and we can feel overwhelmed, give yourself the space to process overwhelm when it comes up, and then find the practices that bring you back to center. So I think that's a critical piece right now. And one of the things that I think is really important that often gets overlooked in some of these spaces where we're talking about systems change in society is human health, our actual personal health. We need to be healthy. We need to be healthy in body, mind, and spirit. There's different ways to think about that. It can start with something as simple as eating better, and just noticing where you're putting a lot of processed foods into your body, what's happening in your thought space, where are you, having junk thoughts, your junk food, and then what is, sort of your grounding in that, your grounding capacity in that. So we can't overlook that bit, and also rest. We need to be able to rest. So this even that might feel overwhelming, right? To someone who's I'm busy, I've got kids, I've got a full-time job, I don't have enough money to make the bills, that I need to pay. So what's a small way that you can start to shift? And just pick one of those things, one of those areas. So for example, if it's going to be spirit, you want to get more grounded in yourself and in your spirit. Might it be, a 5 or 10 minute breathwork practice that you do in the mornings? Might it be a short meditative practice or even a short walk that you do in the mornings before you go out into your day? If you want to focus on your health, might it be just, like you said, shifting to, one meal a day being mostly locally sourced, getting to know some of your farmers in your area and sourcing food from them. If it's going to be something that's, more of your mind, how might you inform yourself about some of these things that are happening from a perspective, not of the breakdown, but of the people who are building the next thing, the new thing, the hopeful spaces, because there's so much out there that's happening. I think part of it is we're just not being given line of sight to the really good work. It's why, podcasts like this are really important, because we can talk about these things and give people line of sight, because mass media is not going to do it. It's going to be all doom and gloom and more of that, right? So another great thing is to do a media fast. Like just, cut off some of the mainstream media if it's really bringing you down. I realized a long time ago, I'm going to know if something really massive happened. I'm going to hear about it. And the rest of it, a lot of it is noise. And it actually increases stress, increases the feeling of helplessness and panic. So find spaces, whether it's podcasts or alternative media sources that are speaking to the hopeful stories, because there's a lot of them out there, and let yourself simmer in that vibration instead. There's lots of different ways to think about it, but I think pick something and start, and you'll start to see an upward spiral of shift happening where you have more spaciousness to do even more of the practices.
Well, I love that. I think you have to start with yourself. And it's somewhat the same story when we start to look at what we want to tackle. If it's in the environmental space, start with your local area first.
Yeah, get to know the place names of your place, right? Like just start there. Get to know the place names. What were their original names? That can be a fun thing to do with your kids even.
Yeah, for sure. I love one of the local parks that just opened in the last few years. Actually has not only the place names and each of the groves of the forest, so to speak, but also what they called the mountain lion or puma, and I can't remember what they are myself.
That's okay.
But it's nice to be able to visit them and to then tell the stories that are on each of the placards to my kids. And the one I'm thinking of specifically is San Vicente. It's a park that often experiences closures because they do a lot of work on the trails and they get hit with wind and storm that creates some dangerous potential for trees to fall, and they want to keep everybody safe. But it's one of the most beautiful short hikes in our area. And so if you're visiting the Santa Cruz area, I encourage you to check out San Vicente.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Beautiful. Yeah, get outside, find the area nearby you where you can get into nature, whatever that looks like.
Yeah. Now, looking ahead, what is your vision for our beloved futures and the role it can play in shaping the cultural conversation about regeneration?
Yeah, so I've got my book coming out in a couple of weeks, which has been a labor of love. It's Mythopoetic. I think to be followed by some other books that might be a little bit more, less in the poetic realm and more in the policy realm. We'll see what wants to happen next. But I really see it as a collective of folks who are holding this vision of more beloved futures, something that's not just surviving, but actually thriving. And it's rooted in these understandings of, the colonial traumas and histories that we're inheriting. So a clear-eyed view of those, like not bypassing any of that stuff, actually going through the storm of reckoning and repair. So people who are interested in that kind of work and willing to sit in the discomfort of what that brings for self and for other, for relationality. So that's a big pillar of it. Because I don't believe we can build something wholly new until we address the harms that we're simmering in now and that have created the toxic systems that we exist in. So it's an invitation into that kind of inquiry, and then building from that place with life at the center. What do life-affirming futures look like? What do futures look like that are co-dreamed with Earth? So Earth as a stakeholder in everything that we do, like a primary stakeholder in everything that we do, and really privileged in our conversations. So the forms that it's going to take, I'm still in that inquiry. I've thought of things like a summit. I've thought of things like online learning journeys. I definitely want to teach my capacity in futures. I'm realizing that that's something, at one point I wanted to be a professor, but I just butted right up against the patriarchy in the university. And I was like, no, probably not. But teaching people how to do this kind of thinking and this sort of futures work feels important. So I'm sure that sort of stuff will be forthcoming. I'm thinking about designing a course in life-affirming futures work. Yeah, and holding space for people like at the farm, the continued teaching that we're doing there. But I really, I saw it as an hour, not the beloved futures, because it's meant to be an invitation to others to join. So I'm in the active inquiry of what that might look like going to the futures. I've got some elders who will be coming to Hawaii next year. We did a beautiful container a few weeks ago where we just brought activists from around the world into the temple on the farm and did a deep dive into the soul of Hawaii, like the true essence of Hawaii, with Hawaiian elders visiting place and volunteering in biocultural restoration spaces, going to some sacred sites and questioning the military narratives of Hawaii. So that was really nourishing for me because it allowed people to see Hawaii in a new way. So that might be one of the streams of work that's coming out. You can kind of get a sense of the core that's holding it all together, and the forms may shift as times move and things change and what's needed shifts.
No, I understand. I can direct people to your website, ourbelovedfutures.com, to pre-order the book, right?
Yes. Yep.
And be an early individual to receive it. I want to say something about your work in a poetic sense. It feels to me like the strongest activists of our time have also trended towards prose. I'm thinking of Kimmerer as an example, of Roald Kimmerer. I'm thinking of Paul Hawken, whose latest book, Carbon, is nothing if not poetry. And who also, when he defined regeneration, I think has a similar view. He said, regeneration is putting life at the center of every action we take and every decision we make. It feels to me like embodying beloved futures is doing the same. So if listeners are to walk away with one idea or practice to start embodying beloved futures in themselves and their community, do you think it just starts there? Is it putting life at the center? What is it doing?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful invitation, is putting life at the center. And I use a capital L with life when I speak of it in that way. Had a really interesting conversation with some folks who are from the Amazon in one of our cohorts, previous Rhizome cohorts. And we talked about life, and, what they were sharing was life and death are together, so it's not just about, I think the mistake we make is that preserve life at all costs, and actually death is part of life. So when we put capital L, life, at the center, we embrace both the decay, the compost, that part of life, as well as the blooming and the flowering and the all of it, right? So it decenters us as an individual who's afraid of our own mortality and puts us into the swimming field of capital L life in service to that. So I think that's a really important piece. And a really simple practice that I've been talking a lot about lately, because it changed my life and I do it with my kids, is thanking our water and thanking our food. So just taking a moment in the morning when I first wake up, my cup of water that I put a little lime and salt into for minerals, and I just sit with it and I say thank you. And I imagine its journey from rain into the aquifer, into the pipes, into my cup, and how miraculous that is, and that water holds memory, and that it's gifting me with the memory of every place it's seen and everything it's done, that there's no new water on earth, it's just been circulated. So this water has a lot to teach me. And I just take that, literally 10 seconds. And then before we eat our meal with the kids, we just thank the food, maybe put our hands over the plate and just radiate some love to the food, thanking it for where it came from, the farmers that grew it, and, that it's nourishing our bodies. And I think these really simple, very short kind of practices just start to shift something within of your understanding of your place in this really beautiful tapestry of life.
Wow. I'm thinking of a line from Desiderata by Max Ehrmann. I think it was, give thanks to God, whatever you perceive him to be, right? And I'm not God-fearing, but yet I have this printed on my wall, right? It's something I just reflect on periodically, because it really is about slowing down and showing appreciation for life, appreciation for what you have. And it feels like we are coming full circle now to that part of the discussion about abundance, right? Like, really understanding that life is a gift. My almost 8-year-old, and I'm going to cry thinking about this, but he just said to me recently, Mom, I'm just so glad that I'm alive.
Oh.
Oh. And we have difficult moments because, parenting is hard, raising a child, especially one who is autistic and he is on the spectrum. You face all sorts of challenges, but he has a deep reflective memory and soul. And he seems to remember being in utero. He talks to me about it,
Yes.
And I believe him.
I do too.
We're taught in a way not to believe these things because it couldn't be possible that you'd have a memory from before, right? Mm-hmm. But he does. And he talks about being glad that he was chosen to come at this time and to be with me.
Wow.
And
so it's so
just
beautiful.
Powerful. And I think we need to get more connected to that mystery of life.
Yes.
Even if it isn't just the simple things like being thankful for the water, having a ritual around it, connecting through water. That's powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such a beautiful story about your son. And it's true, it's like at the end of the day, we get to decide how we live. And I just think it's so much more joyful when we embrace the mystery and allow ourselves to be in that space of gratitude. So, whatever situation you're in, whatever you need to do, and reaching out for help to others to find spaces of gratitude and start to open them a little bit in appreciation and noticing. It's an upward spiral.
Yeah, the noticing. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for joining me today, Aubrey. I welcome you back anytime. And I very much look forward to reading your book. I've yet to have the chance, but I'm going to, and I'll share a review of that with my audience here as well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
For those of you tuning in, I encourage you to explore Aubrey's work through our beloved Futurist and her podcast. It is a simple joy to listen to. You'll find links, as always, in our show notes. And remember, every time you subscribe to Care More, Be Better or sign up for our newsletter, we plant a tree through our partnership with Forest Planet. So if you have yet to do that, please do. And if you loved today's episode, if you found it moved you, I encourage you to share it with those in your community. Ask them to give it a listen. Think about what they could do differently in their lives to connect more deeply with place, with space, with soul. Thank you for being a part of this community, because together we can care more, we can be better, and we can create the futures that we all long for. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.